Knight's tale concerns a peculiar clause that appeared in the final will and testament of Charles Lemp in 1949, a stipulation so disturbing that the attorneys handling the estate requested it be sealed from public record for 50 years. The clause stated that under no circumstances should anyone from the Lemp bloodline ever attempt to reoccupy the mansion on Damanil Place, and that any heir who violated this directive would forfeit their inheritance entirely. What makes this prohibition remarkable is not merely its severity, but the fact that by the time Charles penned these words, he was the last surviving member of what had once been America's most powerful brewing dynasty. He knew something the rest of the world did not. He understood that the mansion itself had become something more than brick and mortar, that it had transformed into a repository of accumulated grief so profound that it had developed a kind of sentience, a hunger that fed on the Lemp name itself. To understand how an empire worth the equivalent of $600 million in today's currency could collapse so completely that its last heir would rather die than let another Lemp cross the threshold, we must travel back to a time when the name Lemp meant power, when it represented the very pinnacle of immigrant success in America. The year is 1876, and William J. Lemp stands before the mansion he has just purchased at 3322 Damanil Place in South St. Louis, a 33-room Victorian palace that will serve as the crown jewel of his brewing empire. William is 40 years old, his hands calloused from years of working in the caves beneath Cherokee Street, where his lager ages in perfect coolness, his mind sharp with the kind of ruthless intelligence that transforms immigrants into titans. He has taken his father's modest Western brewery and turned it into an industrial colossus that produces nearly 1 million barrels annually, shipping refrigerated beer across America on railway cars that bear his name in gold letters. His competitors whisper that William Lemp made a deal with something in those caves, that no man could build such an empire through honest means alone. They are closer to the truth than they realize. The caves beneath St. Louis are not like caves elsewhere. They were formed millions of years ago when the Mississippi River carved through limestone bedrock, creating a subterranean labyrinth that extends for miles beneath the city streets. The Lemps discovered early that these caves maintained a constant 50 degrees year-round, perfect for the lagering process that gave their beer its distinctive character. But there was something else about the caves, something the German immigrant miners who first explored them refused to discuss except in whispered conversations after too much schnapps. The caves had sections that went deeper than any map showed, passages that seemed to shift and reconfigure themselves, chambers where the air felt heavier than it should, where men reported hearing voices that spoke in languages older than German or English, or any tongue known to modern scholars.
Ambitious man. He was a businessman, a pragmatist who believed in ledgers and profit margins and the tangible weight of gold. When his workers came to him with stories about the deep sections, about the feeling of being watched in certain tunnels, about the way their lanterns would sometimes flicker and die for no reason, he dismissed them as the imaginings of men who worked too long in darkness. He ordered tunnels dug connecting his mansion directly to the brewery, a private underground passage that would allow him to walk to work without ever seeing daylight, without ever being seen by competitors or rivals who might attempt to learn his secrets. The tunnel was completed in 1878, lined with brick and lit by gas lamps, a subterranean corridor that represented everything William believed in: efficiency, privacy, control. His architect, a Hungarian immigrant named Victor Szabo, tried to warn him. Victor had worked on excavations in his homeland, had heard stories from miners about certain kinds of limestone that seemed to absorb and retain human emotion, about places where tragedy could literally seep into stone and remain there for decades, slowly accumulating until the location itself became toxic. He tried to explain to William that connecting one's home directly to the earth in this way was dangerous, that it created a kind of circuit through which energies could flow in both directions. William laughed and told Victor he was being paid to build, not to philosophize. The tunnel was completed exactly as William specified. Within 2 years, Victor Sabo had left St. Louis and returned to Hungary, refusing to discuss his work on the Lemp estate with anyone. Within 3 years, the first death occurred. Frederick Lemp was William's favorite son, groomed from birth to inherit the empire. He was handsome, charismatic, beloved by workers and socialites alike. In 1896, at the age of 28, Frederick became engaged to a Chicago heiress, a marriage that would have united 2 fortunes and secured the Lemp dynasty for generations. 3 months before the wedding, Frederick began complaining of headaches. They started mildly, a pressure behind his eyes that came and went, but within weeks they had become debilitating. He would wake screaming in his room on the mansion's 3rd floor, clawing at his temples, begging for the voices to stop. William brought in the finest physicians in St. Louis, then specialists from Chicago and New York. They found nothing wrong. No tumor, no infection, no physical cause for the agony that was slowly destroying his son. Frederick began to change. The charismatic young man who had charmed St. Louis society became withdrawn, paranoid, convinced that something in the house was watching him, waiting for him. He refused to use the tunnel to the brewery, claimed he could hear things moving in the darkness beyond the reach of the gas lamps. In December of 1898, on a night when ice covered the Mississippi and the caves beneath the mansion groaned with the contraction of frozen stone, Frederick locked himself in his room.
The servants heard him pacing for hours, muttering to himself in a voice that did not sound entirely like his own, reciting something in a language none of them recognized. At 3 in the morning, the pacing stopped. At dawn, when William forced open the door, he found Frederick sitting upright in his bed, eyes wide open, staring at something in the corner of the room that no one else could see. He was dead. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the physician who examined the body, Dr. Ernst Hoffman, confided to his wife that night that Frederick's face bore an expression he had never seen on a corpse before, a look not of pain or peace, but of absolute terror mixed with something else, something that looked almost like recognition, as if in his final moments Frederick had seen something he had been expecting all along. William refused to believe his son had simply died. He insisted on a second autopsy, then a third. Each physician confirmed the same thing. Frederick's heart had simply stopped. No disease, no poison, no explanation. But what none of them could explain was why Frederick's fingernails had been worn down to bloody nubs, why the walls of his room bore scratch marks at shoulder height, forming patterns that almost looked like words in a script no one could identify, why every mirror in the room had cracked down the center, despite no one having touched them. William had the room sealed. He told himself it was grief, that he simply could not bear to look at the space where his son had died. But the truth he would never speak aloud even to his wife Julia, was that he was afraid of what he might see if he looked too closely at those scratch marks, afraid that if he studied them long enough, they might begin to make sense.
They were saturated, every molecule of stone infused with accumulated grief and rage and despair, until the location itself had developed something approaching consciousness, a vast and patient hunger that drew sustenance from human misery. The Lemps, in their ambition, in their determination to control and dominate, had done something profoundly dangerous. They had built their empire directly on top of this concentration of suffering, had dug their tunnels straight through it, had created pathways through which this presence could flow upward into their home and their lives. Frederick had been the first to truly sense it, the first to understand on some instinctive level that the mansion was not just a house, but a kind of mouth, and that his family had been feeding it for years without realizing. His death was not random. It was a harvest. Life continued for the Lemps, but it continued differently. William threw himself into the brewery with manic intensity, spending 16 and 18-hour days in his office, sleeping sometimes on a cot beside his desk, rather than returning to the mansion.
Julia, his wife, began to complain of a heaviness in the air, of rooms that felt crowded even when she was alone, of the sensation of being watched by something that moved just beyond the edge of her vision. Their daughter Elsa, who had always been the most sensitive of the children, refused to sleep in her own room anymore, insisting that someone stood at the foot of her bed every night, a figure she could never quite see clearly, but whose presence filled her with a dread so profound she would wake soaking in cold sweat. William dismissed these concerns as grief-induced hysteria. He was a man of science and industry. He did not believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. But even he could not ignore what began happening in the tunnel. Workers using the passage reported hearing footsteps behind them that stopped when they turned to look. The gas lamps would sometimes go out all at once, plunging the entire length of the tunnel into absolute darkness, and in that darkness, men swore they could hear breathing, slow and measured, and far too close. Several workers quit rather than continue using the tunnel. William offered them double wages to return. They refused. By 1900, William had stopped using the tunnel himself, though he never explained why, even to Julia. He would leave for the brewery through the front door like an ordinary man, walking the 3 blocks through the St. Louis streets in all weather, rather than take the private passage he had built at such expense. The business continued to prosper. By 1901, William J. Lemp Brewing Company was producing nearly 1 million barrels annually, had facilities across the Midwest, exported beer to Europe and South America. On paper, the Lemps were untouchable. On paper, they had achieved everything the American dream promised. But something was wrong. William could feel it in his bones, a wrongness that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. He would sometimes stand in his office on the top floor of the brewery and look across the rooftops toward the mansion, and he would feel a pull, like an undertow in deep water, something trying to drag him back down into those rooms and corridors. He began to drink heavily, not his own beer, but whiskey, quantities that would have killed a smaller man. He told himself it was stress, that he was simply working too hard, that he needed to rest. But rest was impossible in the mansion. Every time he closed his eyes in that house, he dreamed of Frederick, not as his son had been in life, but as something else, something that wore Frederick's face, but spoke with a voice like grinding stone.
On February 13th, 1904, William J. Lemp placed the barrel of a Smith & Wesson revolver against his right temple in his office at the brewery and pulled the trigger. He left no note. The official explanation, the one printed in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and repeated in newspapers across the country, was that William had been despondent over the recent death of his close friend Frederick Pabst of the Pabst Brewing Company. Business associates claimed he had been exhibiting signs of nervous exhaustion, that the pressures of running an empire had finally broken him. But those who knew William best, who had seen the change in him over the previous 4 years, understood that something else had hollowed him out from the inside. His brother Louis, who discovered the body, later told his own wife that William's eyes were open when he found him, and that they held the same expression Frederick's had held, that look of terrible recognition. The family buried William quickly, quietly, with far less ceremony than Frederick had received. They did not want questions. They did not want St. Louis society examining too closely the fact that the patriarch of their dynasty had chosen to die in his office rather than at home, that in his final moments he had surrounded himself with ledgers and contracts and the trappings of business, as if these tangible things could protect him from whatever he had finally been forced to confront. William J. Lemp, Jr., the eldest surviving son, inherited everything. He was 33 years old, a capable businessman who had been groomed alongside Frederick to run the empire. But where Frederick had been charismatic and beloved, William Jr. was cold, analytical, a man who approached life as a series of calculations and optimal outcomes. He did not believe in his father's breakdown, refused to accept that a man of such strength could simply collapse under pressure. There had to be an explanation, something rational, something he could identify and eliminate. He moved into the mansion with his wife Lillian, a beautiful woman 20 years his junior who came from St. Louis high society and who married William Jr. for his name and his fortune. She was called the Lavender Lady, always dressed in shades of purple,
always perfumed with imported French lavender water, always performing for an audience even when she was alone. Lillian loved the mansion at first. She loved the imported Italian marble and the hand-painted ceilings and the ornate woodwork that spoke of old-world craftsmanship. She loved hosting parties in the grand ballroom, loved the way St. Louis society would dress in their finest to attend her soirees, loved being the center of attention in a house that seemed designed for spectacle. But within months of moving in, Lillian began to change. The change was subtle at first, barely noticeable even to William Jr., who shared her bed. She would pause sometimes in the middle of conversations, her eyes going distant, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. She developed an obsession with certain rooms, particularly the atrium with its stained glass skylight, spending hours there even in winter when the space was too cold for comfort. She would stand beneath that colored glass and stare upward, her lips moving silently, and when William Jr. asked what she was doing, she would smile vaguely and say she was praying, though Lillian had never been religious.
The servants began to notice things. Items would move in the mansion, not dramatically but persistently. A vase placed on one table would appear on another. Doors that had been locked would be found standing open. The temperature in certain rooms would drop precipitously for no reason, cold enough that breath became visible, and then just as suddenly returned to normal. The servants who slept in the mansion, those whose rooms were on the 3rd and 4th floors, reported the worst of it. They heard footsteps in the corridors at night, slow and deliberate, the sound of someone pacing back and forth for hours. They heard voices, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes just a low muttering that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. Several maids quit without notice, refusing to explain why, their faces pale and drawn as they collected their final wages and fled. William Jr. dismissed all of this as superstition and nerves. He was a modern man living in the 20th century. The mansion was old, it settled and creaked, and overwrought imaginations filled in the rest. He refused to acknowledge that he himself had started avoiding certain parts of the house, that he had developed routes through the mansion that carefully bypassed the sealed room where Frederick had died, that he never went down into the caves anymore, even though they were technically part of his property. In 1908, after 4 years of marriage, Lillian Lemp did something almost unheard of in her social circle. She filed for divorce. The scandal was immediate and immense. Divorce among St. Louis high society was rare enough, but for the wife of William Lemp Jr. to publicly dissolve her marriage was nearly unprecedented. The divorce proceedings were ugly and public, with Lillian claiming mental cruelty and alleging that William Jr. was cold, controlling, and emotionally abusive. William Jr. countered that Lillian was unstable, that she had become increasingly erratic and paranoid during their marriage, that she suffered from delusions. What neither of them said publicly, what Lillian would only whisper years later to her sister after too much wine, was the real reason she left. She told her sister that the mansion had begun speaking to her, that she could hear it in the quiet hours before dawn, a voice that came up through the floors and down through the ceilings, a voice that knew things about her no one should know, secrets she had never told anyone. The voice promised her things, whispered about power and beauty that would never fade, about ways to make William Jr. love her the way she deserved. All she had to do was go down into the caves, down to the deep sections where the voice was strongest, and perform a simple ritual. Lillian had been tempted. She had stood at the entrance to the tunnel on 3 separate nights, dressed in her lavender gown, a candle trembling in her hand, trying to summon the courage to descend. Each time she had turned back at the last moment, driven away not by fear, but by a sudden clarity, a moment of absolute understanding that if she went down into those caves, she would never come back up, not as herself, not as anything human. She fled the mansion and never returned, not even to collect her belongings. She would live another 40 years, remarrying twice, but she never spoke publicly about her time in the Lemp mansion, and in her final years she would wake screaming from nightmares about tunnels that went down forever, about voices that called her name in the darkness. William Jr. remarried quickly, almost frantically, to a woman named Ellie Limburg just 8 months after the divorce was finalized.
If he thought a new wife would change the atmosphere in the mansion, he was mistaken. Ellie was practical and no nonsense, a woman who believed in hard work and Christian virtue. She did not believe in ghosts or spirits or anything that could not be explained by science. But even Ellie could not ignore what was happening in the house. The phenomena were escalating. Objects did not just move anymore, they were found arranged in patterns, symbols that looked almost like writing in a language no one recognized. The servants reported seeing figures in the corridors, shadowy forms that would appear at the end of a hallway and then simply dissolve when approached. The smell of lavender would sometimes permeate the house, even though Ellie refused to use perfume of any kind, refused to have lavender plants on the property, as if the mansion itself was remembering Lillian and manifesting her presence. William Jr. tried to maintain normalcy. He continued running the brewery, continued hosting parties, continued presenting the facade of a successful businessman living in a magnificent home. But those who knew him well saw the cracks forming. He drank more, slept less, would sometimes be found standing in empty rooms, staring at the walls with an expression that suggested he was seeing something no one else could. His younger brother Edwin had taken over much of the day-to-day operations of the brewery, and it was Edwin who began to notice the pattern. Every Lemp who spent significant time in the mansion began to deteriorate. It was not immediate, not obvious, but it was consistent. They would become withdrawn, paranoid, obsessed with certain rooms or certain objects. They would report headaches, insomnia, the sensation of being watched, and eventually they would either flee like Lillian had, or they would do what Frederick and William Sr. had done. Edwin tried to discuss this with William Jr., tried to suggest that perhaps the family should sell the mansion, move to a different location, start fresh somewhere that did not carry the weight of accumulated tragedy. William Jr. refused to even consider it. The mansion was a symbol of everything the Lemps had built, everything they had achieved. To abandon it would be to admit defeat, to let the world see that the great brewing dynasty was vulnerable. Pride, that most fundamental of sins, kept the Lemps chained to a house that was slowly consuming them. In 1920, the world changed for the Lemps in ways that had nothing to do with ghosts or curses. Prohibition became law, and overnight the beer business in America ceased to exist. The William J. Lemp Brewing Company, which had produced nearly 1 million barrels annually at its peak, was suddenly worthless.
William Jr. tried to adapt, tried to convert the brewery to produce non-alcoholic beverages, but the economics made no sense. The machinery, the distribution network, the entire infrastructure was designed for beer production. Within 2 years, the company was operating at a massive loss. The other St. Louis breweries were facing the same crisis, but most of them managed to survive through various means. Anheuser-Busch pivoted to produce ice cream, soft drinks, and yeast. But William Jr., whether through stubbornness or some deeper paralysis, could not make the transition work. In 1922, he made the decision that would seal the family's fate. He closed the brewery permanently and sold the property and equipment at auction for a fraction of its value. The William J. Lemp Brewing Company, which had once been valued at $7 million, sold for just $588,000. It was a humiliation beyond comprehension, a public destruction of everything his father and grandfather had built. The mansion, which had once been filled with the sounds of parties and laughter, became silent. William Jr. stopped hosting events, stopped seeing friends, stopped maintaining any pretense of normalcy. He would spend days in his office within the mansion, doors locked, refusing meals, emerging only occasionally, looking decades older than his years. Ellie tried to reach him, tried to pull him back from whatever abyss he was staring into, but he had gone somewhere beyond her ability to follow. The servants reported that he had begun going down into the caves again, spending hours in the tunnels with only a lantern, and when he emerged, his clothes would be covered in limestone dust, and his hands would be scraped and bleeding, as if he had been digging or clawing at the walls. On December 29, 1922, William J. Lemp Jr. locked himself in his office in the mansion. He spent several hours writing letters, though their contents would never be made fully public. Then he retrieved a revolver from his desk drawer, the same Smith & Wesson model his father had used,
possibly the same gun, though no one could confirm this, and he shot himself in the chest. Unlike his father, William Jr. did not die immediately. He lived for several minutes, long enough for servants who heard the shot to break down the door, long enough to look at them with eyes that held not pain, but something that looked almost like relief.
His final words, whispered to the butler who cradled his head, were never officially recorded, but the butler, a German immigrant named Hans Müller, told his family that William Jr. said only 3 words in his ancestral language: "Es ist fertig," it is finished. The death sent shockwaves through what remained of St. Louis high society, not because suicide was unheard of, but because it was the second Lemp patriarch to die by his own hand in less than 20 years. Newspapers began to speak of a Lemp curse, of something rotten in the bloodline, of the sins of ambition coming due. But these were just stories, narratives that made sense to people who had never stood in the mansion at 3 a.m, who had never felt the weight of the air in those rooms, who had never heard what the servants heard in the darkness. The mansion passed to William Jr.'s younger brother, Edwin, who wanted nothing to do with it. Edwin had built his own life, separate from the family business, had married a woman named Agnes, and started his own company manufacturing shoes. He had watched his family destroy themselves one by one, and had sworn he would break the pattern. He put the mansion up for sale immediately, pricing it well below market value just to be rid of it. But even at a discount, no one wanted to buy the Lemp mansion. Its reputation had become toxic. Potential buyers would tour the property once and never return, offering vague excuses about the layout not suiting their needs or the location being inconvenient. Real estate agents who worked the property reported feeling inexplicably anxious during showings, developing headaches that would disappear the moment they left the grounds. One agent, a woman named Catherine Reynolds, who specialized in luxury properties, told her husband after showing the mansion 3 times that she would never enter it again, that there was something fundamentally wrong with the house, something that made her skin crawl and her stomach turn. She could not articulate exactly what it was, only that every instinct she possessed screamed at her to leave and never come back. The mansion sat empty for months, then years. Edwin paid for minimal maintenance, enough to keep the roof from leaking and the pipes from freezing, but otherwise let the property deteriorate. The gardens became overgrown, the paint began to peel, the ornate details that had once proclaimed wealth and power began to fade and crack. The building started to look haunted even in daylight, its windows like empty eyes, its grand entrance like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. During this period of abandonment, the neighborhood around the mansion began to report strange occurrences. Residents on Demonil Place would hear music coming from the empty house late at night, the sound of a piano playing waltzes, though no piano remained inside. People walking past the property after dark reported seeing lights moving through the windows, not electric lights, but the warm flicker of gas lamps or candles, though the gas had been shut off and no one had access to the building. Children who lived nearby developed a game where they would dare each other to touch the mansion's front gate, but none of them would actually approach the house itself. They claimed they could feel something watching them from the windows, something that did not want them there. The police were called several times to investigate reports of intruders or squatters, but each search of the property found no one, just empty rooms thick with dust and silence. One officer, a veteran named Thomas O'Brien, who had served in the First World War and seen horrors in the trenches of France, refused to enter the mansion after his first search. He told his captain that he had faced German artillery and poison gas without flinching, but there was something in that house that terrified him on a level he could not explain, something that made the war seem almost preferable by comparison. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Great Depression began, making the already unsellable mansion even more impossible to move. Edwin eventually stopped trying. He had his own problems, his shoe manufacturing business struggling to survive in an economy where no one could afford luxuries. The mansion became just another albatross around the neck of a family that seemed cursed to collect them. But the house was not finished with the Lemps. Not yet. Elsa Lemp, William Sr.'s daughter, had inherited a portion of the family fortune, and had been living in the mansion on and off throughout the 1920s and 30s, one of the few family members willing to occupy the property. Elsa had never married, had devoted her life to art and music and the cultivation of beauty. She was in her 50s by the 1930s, a woman who had watched her father, brother, and nephew all die violently, who had seen the family empire crumble into dust. She had always been the most sensitive of the Lemps, the one most attuned to the atmosphere of the mansion, and perhaps because of this, she was also the one most damaged by it. Elsa began to exhibit signs of severe mental deterioration in the late 1930s. She would have conversations with people who were not there, would set places at the dinner table for Frederick and William Sr., would insist that she could hear them walking in the corridors at night. She became convinced that the mansion was alive, that it had a consciousness and a will, that it was feeding on the family and had been feeding on them for decades. She tried to warn the surviving Lemps, tried to make them understand that the house needed to be destroyed, that selling it was not enough, that as long as the structure stood, it would continue to hunger. No one listened. They dismissed her warnings as the ravings of a lonely, disturbed woman who had spent too much time alone in that house. On March 20th, 1943, Elsa Lemp was found dead in her bed in the mansion. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who found her, including her personal physician, Dr. Herman Klein, noted that her face bore that same expression.
The expression of recognition mixed with terror, the look that had marked Frederick's death decades earlier, the look that seemed to be the signature of the mansion itself, claiming another victim. What was not included in any official report, what Dr. Klein confided only to his own journal, which would not be discovered until after his death in 1967, was that Elsa's room, when he entered it, had been freezing cold, despite it being a warm spring day, that every mirror in the room had been covered with cloth, as if Elsa had not wanted to see her own reflection, and that written on the wall above her bed, in what appeared to be charcoal, were words in that same unknown script that had appeared after Frederick's death, symbols that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally. Dr. Klein had ordered the wall painted over immediately, had told the workers to burn the cloths that covered the mirrors, had tried to erase every trace of what he had seen, because he understood on some fundamental level that these symbols were not just writing, but invocations, that they were calling something or holding something at bay, and he did not want to know which. With Elsa's death, only 2 Lemps remained: Edwin, who had successfully kept his distance from the mansion for years, and Charles, the youngest son of William Jr., who was in his early 40s and had inherited his father's cold, analytical mind. Charles had been living in the mansion despite his Uncle Edwin's warnings, drawn back to the property by something he could not quite articulate. He told himself it was practicality, that the mansion was paid for and maintaining it was cheaper than renting elsewhere during the Depression. But the truth was something he barely admitted even to himself. He could feel the house calling to him, a pull that intensified the longer he stayed away, an ache like homesickness, but deeper, more visceral, as if part of his soul had been left in those rooms and was crying out to be reunited. Charles was different from his predecessors in one crucial way. He was curious. Where William Sr. and William Jr. had tried to ignore the phenomena, had dismissed the strange occurrences and retreated into denial, Charles began to investigate. He started documenting everything, keeping meticulous records of every unexplained event, every cold spot, every shadow that moved independently, every voice that whispered from empty rooms. He approached the haunting scientifically, as a problem to be solved, a mystery to be unraveled. This was a mistake. Charles began spending time in the caves, exploring sections that had been closed off for decades, mapping tunnels that did not appear on any official brewery plans. He discovered chambers that seemed to have been used for purposes that had nothing to do with beer storage,
rooms with walls marked by scratches and stains that looked disturbingly organic. He found objects left behind, items that made no sense.
Children's toys from the 1800s, surgical instruments that had no place in a brewery, books written in languages he could not identify, with pages that seemed to be made of something that was not quite paper, material that was too smooth, too warm to the touch, almost like skin. In one of the deepest chambers, a room that required crawling through a passage so narrow that Charles had to move on his stomach, he found something that stopped his investigation cold. The chamber was circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that rose into darkness beyond the reach of his lantern. The walls were covered completely in those symbols, the same script that had appeared after Frederick's death, the same markings that had been on Elsa's wall. But here they were not random. Here they formed a pattern, a spiral that began at floor level and wound upward, disappearing into the darkness above. The symbols seemed to pulse in his lantern light, seemed almost to breathe, and when Charles stared at them long enough, he began to feel something shift in his perception, began to understand that they were not just writing, but instructions, a ritual encoded in visual form. At the center of the chamber was a depression in the stone floor, circular and worn smooth, and when Charles shone his light into it, he saw that it was filled with liquid, though no water had dripped from the ceiling, and the stone was not damp. The liquid was dark, viscous, and it moved on its own, swirling slowly in patterns that mimicked the symbols on the walls.
Charles did not go back into the caves. He sealed the basement entrance with bricks and mortar, working through the night with a feverish intensity, mixing concrete with his bare hands until they bled, desperate to create a barrier between himself and whatever dwelt in the depths below. But sealing the entrance did nothing to stop what happened next. The mansion began to change in ways that could not be ignored or rationalized. Rooms that had been empty for years suddenly felt occupied, as if invisible presences had moved in and taken residence. Charles would enter the dining room and find chairs pulled away from the table, positioned as if people had just been sitting there, though dust on the seats showed no disturbance. He would close doors and return minutes later to find them standing open. Books in the library would be found on the floor, opened to specific pages, and when Charles examined these pages, he would discover they were always passages about death, about grief, about the dissolution of families and the end of bloodlines. The phenomena escalated. Charles began to hear footsteps on the third floor, the sound of pacing that went on for hours, back and forth, the same pattern Frederick had traced in the nights before his death. He would hear voices, conversations between multiple people, but when he rushed to find the source, the voices would stop the moment he opened the door, leaving only silence and the smell of old lavender. Objects began to move more dramatically. A portrait of William Sr. that hung in the main hall was found face down on the floor one morning, the glass shattered, though no one had touched it, and no vibration or wind could explain its fall. The grandfather clock in the entrance hall, which had not worked for 20 years, suddenly began to chime, but it chimed at incorrect hours, 13 times at midnight, 17 times at dawn, numbers that had no meaning in standard time, but that Charles began to suspect held significance in some other system, some other way of marking the passage of something that was not quite time. Charles started to see things, not vague shadows or tricks of light, but figures, distinct and detailed.
He would glimpse someone standing at the end of a corridor, there for just a moment before vanishing, but in that moment he could see their clothing, their posture, sometimes even their faces. He saw Frederick standing in the doorway of his sealed room, dressed in the suit he had been buried in, his expression sad and warning. He saw William Sr. sitting in the library, reading a newspaper from 1904, the day before his death,
looking up at Charles with eyes that held knowledge of everything that was to come. He saw Lillian in her lavender dress, standing beneath the stained glass skylight in the atrium, her lips moving silently, speaking words that Charles could not hear, but somehow understood were instructions, were warnings, were pleas for him to leave while he still could. Most disturbing of all, he began to see himself. He would catch his own reflection moving independently in mirrors, turning to look at him with an expression he had never worn, a look of hunger and anticipation. He would see himself standing in rooms he had not entered, watching himself with eyes that had gone completely black, no iris, no white, just darkness that seemed to extend infinitely inward. These visions of himself were always positioned between him and the exits, as if blocking his escape, as if some part of him that belonged to the house was trying to prevent the rest of him from leaving. Charles understood, finally, what Elsa had tried to tell them. The mansion was not haunted by the ghosts of dead Lemps. The mansion had absorbed them, had consumed their deaths and their suffering, and integrated these things into its very structure. The house had become a kind of organism, feeding on tragedy, growing stronger with each suicide, each moment of despair. The Lemps had not built an empire and then been destroyed by bad luck or poor decisions. They had been cultivated, grown like crops, their wealth and success merely a means of keeping them in place long enough for the harvest. Everything that had happened, from William Sr.'s decision to dig the tunnels, to Frederick's death, to prohibition destroying the business, all of it had been arranged, orchestrated by something that operated on timescales humans could barely comprehend, something that had been waiting in those caves long before the first German immigrants arrived in St. Louis. Charles tried to leave. He packed a bag, walked to the front door, put his hand on the knob, and could not turn it. Not because it was locked, not because of any physical impediment, but because his body simply refused to obey him. His hand remained frozen on the doorknob, muscles rigid, while his mind screamed at it to turn, to open, to let him escape. He stood there for an hour, unable to move, unable to cry out, unable to do anything but stare at his own traitorous hand. When he finally could move again, when whatever had gripped him released its hold, Charles did not try to leave through any other door. He understood that the house would not let him go. He belonged to it now, completely, and any attempt to escape would only result in the same paralysis, the same humiliating demonstration that his will was no longer his own. He had one choice left, the same choice Frederick had made, the same choice William Sr. and William Jr. had made, the choice that the house had been leading him toward from the moment he returned to the mansion. Charles spent the next few weeks setting his affairs in order with the methodical precision that had always characterized his approach to life. He wrote letters to his Uncle Edwin, to his few remaining friends, to various business associates. He updated his will, making specific provisions about the mansion that would not be fully understood until they were read after his death.
On May 10th, 1949, Charles Lemp went down into the basement of the mansion, not to the sealed entrance that led to the caves, but to a smaller room that had once served as a wine cellar, a space that was cool and dark and quiet. He brought with him the same Smith & Wesson revolver that his father had used, the gun that had possibly been used by his grandfather as well, a weapon that had become a family heirloom of the most morbid kind. He sat on the floor with his back against the limestone wall, the stone that had been there for millions of years, that had absorbed so much suffering, that had waited so patiently for this moment. Charles placed the barrel against his temple and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the empty mansion, through rooms that had witnessed 4 generations of Lemp prosperity and decline, through corridors where the family had walked as kings of their industry and as prisoners of something they never fully understood. The sound traveled down through the floor, down into the earth itself, down into the caves, where it reverberated through chambers both mapped and unmapped,
through passages that led to places no human had ever seen, down to that circular room with its liquid center and its spiral of symbols, where something listened and was satisfied. Edwin found the body 3 days later. He had come to check on Charles after receiving no response to his letters, had used his key to enter through the front door, and had followed the smell down to the basement. What he found there sent him to his knees. Charles was slumped against the wall, the revolver still in his hand, his blood long since dried on the limestone. But it was not the death itself that broke Edwin. It was what Charles had written on the walls before he died. Using what appeared to be his own blood, Charles had covered every surface of the wine cellar with those symbols, the same script that had appeared throughout the house's history, the same markings that cover the walls in the deep chamber. But Charles had not just copied them, he had completed them. The symbols formed a continuous narrative, a story that began at the entrance to the room and spiraled inward, ending directly above where Charles sat. And Edwin, staring at those symbols, found that he could read them, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, some part of his consciousness that the house had activated just by virtue of him being a Lemp, by virtue of him carrying the bloodline that had been bound to this place for so long. The symbols told the story of the caves, of the thing that dwelt in them, of its nature and its hunger. They explained that the entity was old beyond human reckoning, that it existed in the limestone itself, that it was the accumulated consciousness of every death and every moment of suffering that had occurred in these caves over millions of years. The Native American tribes who had once lived here had known about it, had carefully avoided the cave systems, had built their settlements elsewhere, and warned their children to stay away from the places where the stone felt wrong. But European settlers did not listen to native warnings. They saw the caves as resources, as solutions to practical problems like beer storage. They dug tunnels, expanded chambers, created pathways that allowed the entity to spread, to extend its influence upward into the world of light and air. The Lemps had not been random victims. They had been chosen, selected because their ambition and their pride made them perfect vessels for what the entity needed. It did not just feed on death and suffering. It fed on the transformation of hope into despair, on the corruption of success into failure, on the systematic dismantling of everything a person valued. The greater the heights the Lemps achieved, the more nourishing their eventual destruction became. The entity had orchestrated everything, influencing decisions in ways so subtle that they seemed like natural business choices, creating circumstances that appeared to be bad luck or poor timing, all of it designed to keep the family trapped in the mansion, to keep them breeding and dying, and feeding the hunger that could never be satisfied. The symbols explained that Charles had finally understood, had realized that he could not escape, that no Lemp could escape as long as the bloodline continued. And so he had made a different choice. The final symbols, the ones written directly above his body, were not part of the narrative. They were a curse, a binding, a desperate attempt to seal the entity away using the only power Charles had left, the power of the last Lemp death. He had encoded into those symbols a prohibition, a command that no one of Lemp blood should ever enter this house again, that the bloodline should end with him, that the entity should be starved of its chosen prey. Edwin understood in that moment that Charles had sacrificed himself not just to escape, but to save Edwin, to ensure that the last surviving Lemp would have the knowledge and the motivation to stay away, to let the family name die out completely, rather than provide even one more generation for the entity to consume. Edwin backed out of the wine cellar slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might wake something that was currently sleeping. He did not clean Charles's blood from the walls. He did not remove the body immediately. Instead, he went upstairs, found paper and pen, and began to write his own letters, his own instructions. He arranged for Charles to be buried quickly and quietly. He contacted lawyers and had documents drawn up that would seal Charles's will and its specific provisions from public access for 50 years. He put the mansion on the market again, pricing it so low that it was essentially being given away, but this time he included detailed warnings about the property's history, about the deaths that had occurred there, about the persistent reports of paranormal activity. He wanted anyone who bought it to understand exactly what they were purchasing. The mansion sold within a month, to a couple who planned to convert it into a boarding house.
Edwin warned them personally, sat them down in their lawyer's office and told them everything he knew, everything he had experienced, everything Charles had written on those walls. They listened politely and assured him they did not believe in ghosts, that they were practical people who saw only a beautiful historic building being sold at a remarkable discount. Edwin left that meeting knowing he had done all he could, knowing that some people would have to learn certain lessons themselves. He never entered the mansion again. He would live another 20 years, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1969, the only Lemp to die of natural causes in his own bed, surrounded by family. In his final will, he included a codicil that matched Charles's prohibition, a formal legal statement advising any remaining Lemp descendants to avoid the mansion at 3322 Demenel Place under any circumstances, and to let the family name die out rather than risk continuing the cycle. The boarding house failed within 2 years. The couple who had purchased the mansion found that tenants would not stay, that people who rented rooms would move out within weeks, complaining of nightmares, of feeling watched, of hearing voices and footsteps in empty corridors. The building cycled through several owners over the next decades, serving at various times as a boarding house, a restaurant, and office building, each venture failing in turn. No business established in the Lemp mansion ever prospered. No family who tried to live there ever stayed for long. The building developed a reputation, became known as the most haunted location in St. Louis, attracted ghost hunters and paranormal investigators who would spend nights in the mansion documenting phenomena that ranged from unexplained cold spots to full-body apparitions. In the 1970s, the mansion was purchased by the Pointer family, who had the vision and the determination to embrace rather than fight the building's reputation. They restored the mansion to something approximating its original grandeur and opened it as a restaurant and inn, marketing it explicitly as a haunted location. The business model worked, attracting tourists and curiosity seekers who wanted to experience the Lemp legend firsthand. The Pointer family would own and operate the mansion for decades, becoming experts in its history and its hauntings, documenting hundreds of paranormal incidents reported by staff and guests. But even the Pointers, who had made peace with the mansion's nature, who treated the spirits with respect and even affection, understood that there were boundaries that should not be crossed. The wine cellar where Charles died remained sealed, the symbols he had written on the walls left untouched beneath layers of paint and plaster. The tunnels to the brewery and the deep caves were permanently closed, their entrances filled with concrete and steel. The third floor, where Frederick had died, was renovated and open to guests, but certain rooms on that floor remained perpetually cold, regardless of the heating system, and guests who stayed in those rooms often checked out early, pale and shaken, unwilling to discuss what they had experienced. Staff members who worked at the mansion for years developed their own protocols for dealing with the phenomena. They learned which rooms were safe to enter alone and which required a partner. They learned that certain hallways should not be walked down after midnight. They learned that if you heard your name called from an empty room, you did not answer, you did not investigate, you simply continued with your work and pretended you had heard nothing. They learned that the mansion had moods, that there were nights when the air felt heavier than usual, when shadows moved more freely, when the temperature would drop 20 degrees in seconds, and on those nights, the wise employees would finish their tasks quickly and leave before full darkness fell. The most experienced staff members, those who had worked at the mansion for a decade or more, developed an almost intuitive sense for the entity that dwelt there. They understood that it was not malicious in the way humans understood malice. It did not hate. It simply hungered, and it had been hungry for a very long time. The Lemp deaths had sated it for a while, had given it decades of nourishment, but that sustenance was finite, and as the years passed and no new Lemps entered the building, the entity began to search for other sources of the specific emotional frequency it required. It could not feed on casual fear, on the delighted shivers of tourists who came hoping to see a ghost. That emotion was too shallow, too transient. What it needed was despair, the kind of deep existential horror that came from realizing you were trapped, that there was no escape, that everything you had built and everything you loved was going to be taken from you piece by piece. It needed the Lemp experience, and without Lemps to provide it, the entity had to become more creative. There were incidents over the years that were not publicized, events that the Pointer family and subsequent owners chose not to discuss openly because they were too disturbing, too far beyond the realm of harmless haunting.
There was the night manager who was found in the basement in a catatonic state, staring at the sealed wine cellar door, and who never spoke another coherent word for the remaining 3 years of his life. There was the paranormal investigator who spent the night in Frederick's room, and was discovered at dawn having carved symbols into his own arms with a broken piece of mirror, symbols that matched those Charles had written, though the investigator had never seen them and had no knowledge of their existence. There was the couple who stayed in the mansion on their anniversary, and were found the next morning having aged seemingly decades overnight, their hair gone white, their faces lined and haggard, both of them insisting that they had lived through 50 years in a single night, that the mansion had shown them their entire future, every moment of decline and loss and death, compressed into 8 hours of subjective experience, from which they would never fully recover.
These incidents were rare, occurring perhaps once every few years, but they established a pattern that those who paid attention could not ignore. The mansion was not satisfied with its current diet of tourist fear and investigation thrill. It was searching, probing, testing each person who entered to see if they might provide the deeper nourishment it craved. Most people were safe, because most people did not stay long enough, did not open themselves enough, did not have the specific psychological vulnerabilities that the entity required. But every so often, someone would come along who resonated at the right frequency, whose personal traumas or fears or obsessions created a crack through which the mansion could reach, and when that happened, the results were devastating. The academic community began to take interest in the Lemp mansion in the late 1990s, not because they believed in ghosts, but because the location represented a unique case study in collective trauma and memorialized tragedy. Psychologists studied how the mansion's reputation affected visitor behavior, how suggestion and expectation could create subjective paranormal experiences. Historians examined the Lemp family's business records and personal correspondence, trying to understand the practical factors that led to the dynasty's collapse. Architectural experts analyzed the building's unusual features, the underground connections, the cave system, looking for environmental explanations for the reported phenomena, such as infrasound from underground water movement or electromagnetic anomalies from the limestone. But none of these researchers, no matter how skeptical or scientific their approach, could fully explain what happened in the mansion. The cold spots were too localized and too consistent to be explained by drafts or poor insulation. The apparitions were too detailed and too frequently corroborated by multiple witnesses to be dismissed as hallucination or misperception. The physical phenomena, objects moving, doors opening and closing, sounds of footsteps and voices, occurred too reliably and too predictably to attribute it to natural causes or hoaxing. One researcher, Dr. Margaret Chen from Washington University, spent 6 months conducting a comprehensive environmental and psychological study of the mansion in 2003. She installed monitoring equipment throughout the building, cameras and audio recorders and temperature sensors and electromagnetic field detectors, creating what amounted to a complete surveillance system. She interviewed dozens of staff members and guests, documenting their experiences and looking for patterns. She examined historical records, studied the building's construction, mapped the cave systems beneath. Her goal was to produce a definitive explanation for the Lemp haunting, to either prove it was genuine paranormal activity or to identify the combination of environmental and psychological factors that created the illusion of haunting. What she discovered terrified her. The monitoring equipment recorded anomalies that had no conventional explanation, temperature drops of 30 degrees in seconds with no corresponding air movement, electromagnetic spikes that occurred in patterns that seemed almost linguistic, audio recordings that captured voices speaking in what linguistic experts identified as Middle High German, mixed with something older, fragments of what might be Proto-Germanic or Pre-Germanic languages that should not exist in any modern context. But it was the pattern analysis that truly disturbed Dr. Chen. She discovered that the paranormal activity in the mansion operated on cycles, that it intensified and diminished according to a rhythm that had nothing to do with external factors like weather or visitor traffic. The cycles corresponded instead to the anniversary dates of the Lemp deaths, with activity spiking in February around William Sr.'s suicide
in December around William Jr.'s death, in March around Elsa's passing, and in May around Charles's final act. But the cycles were not simple repetitions. They were cumulative, each year building on the previous years, the intensity increasing gradually but measurably over time. Dr. Chen realized that the entity, whatever it was growing stronger, that it was somehow feeding on the attention and the fear and the continued remembrance of the Lemp tragedy. Every ghost tour that told the story, every paranormal investigation that documented the phenomena, every article and book and documentary that spread the legend, all of it was functioning as a kind of sacrifice, an offering of human attention and emotional energy that sustained and strengthened the presence in the mansion. She tried to publish her findings but found that no reputable journal would accept her paper. The data was too anomalous, the conclusions too far outside the bounds of accepted science. The few colleagues she shared her results with suggested gently that she had become too immersed in her subject matter, that 6 months in the mansion had affected her objectivity. Dr. Chen destroyed her recordings and her notes and resigned her position at the university. She moved to California and never spoke publicly about her research again, though those who knew her said she developed an intense aversion to old buildings and would go to great lengths to avoid any structure built before 1900. The Lemp Mansion continues to operate today as a restaurant and inn, continues to attract visitors who want to experience its dark history firsthand. The building has been featured on countless paranormal television shows, has been investigated by hundreds of ghost hunting teams, has become an icon of American haunting folklore. The current owners maintain the space respectfully, preserving its historical character while running a successful business, and they will tell you that the ghosts are part of the family now, that the mansion has its own personality, that you learn to coexist with it if you want to work there. But if you talk to the staff privately, if you catch them in an unguarded moment, they will tell you things that do not make it into the promotional materials or the tour scripts. They will tell you that there are still places in the mansion that feel fundamentally wrong, that resist all attempts at renovation or cleaning, where paint will not adhere properly, and where plants will not grow no matter how much care they receive.
They will tell you about the dreams, how staff members who work there for more than a year begin to have the same recurring nightmare, a dream of walking through tunnels that descend forever, of following a voice that calls from the darkness, of arriving finally in that circular chamber with its liquid center and its spiral of symbols, and of understanding in the dream what those symbols mean, what they are instructing you to do, only to wake with the knowledge fading like smoke, leaving behind only an ache and a sense of having lost something precious and terrible. They will tell you that sometimes, late at night, when the restaurant has closed and the guests are asleep in their rooms, you can hear music coming from the 3rd floor, the sound of a piano playing waltzes in the style of the 1890s, though no piano exists on that floor and has not for decades. They will tell you that if you stand in the atrium beneath the stained glass skylight at exactly 3:13 in the morning, you will smell lavender so strong it makes your eyes water, and if you are unfortunate enough to look up at that moment, you might see Lillian standing there, translucent and shimmering, her mouth open in a silent scream that has been going on for over a century. They will tell you about the photographs, how digital cameras will sometimes capture things that were not visible to the naked eye, figures standing in doorways or sitting at tables, faces pressed against windows from the inside, and how these figures always have the same expression, that look of recognition and terror that marked the Lemp deaths. And they will tell you, in voices that drop to whispers, about the basement, about the sealed wine cellar that no one is allowed to enter, about how sometimes late at night you can hear sounds coming from behind that door, the sound of someone writing on walls, the scratch of fingernails or something sharper dragging across stone, carving symbols that no one will ever see, but that everyone who works in the mansion can feel, a weight that presses down from below, a presence that is always waiting, always patient, always hungry. The academic explanations, the environmental theories, the psychological frameworks, all of them fail when confronted with the lived reality of the Lemp Mansion. This is not a place where the dead linger because they cannot find peace.
This is a place where death itself has become concentrated, where suffering has achieved a kind of crystalline permanence, where the boundary between past and present has worn so thin that they exist simultaneously, overlapping, bleeding into each other. The Lemps are still dying in that house, not metaphorically, but actually, their deaths replaying in an eternal loop, each suicide feeding the entity that orchestrated them, each moment of despair nourishing the hunger that can never be satisfied. And the entity is still there, still waiting in the caves beneath Cherokee Street, in the tunnels that were never fully sealed, in the limestone that remembers everything. It learned from the Lemps, learned what humans taste like when they fall from great heights, learned the specific flavor of dynastic collapse and inherited sorrow. It is patient. It has been patient for millions of years, and it can wait millions more. But it prefers not to wait. It prefers to feed. And so it calls out, sends its invitation through the limestone, and up through the foundation, and into the rooms where tourists sleep and staff members work. It searches for the vulnerable, for those who carry their own traumas, for anyone who might resonate at the right frequency. Most people resist without even knowing they are resisting, protected by the armor of their skepticism, or their psychological health, or simply their lack of attunement to the frequencies at which the entity operates. But some people hear the call clearly, feel the pull strongly, and find themselves drawn back to the mansion again and again, unable to explain why, unable to stay away. These are the ones the entity cultivates, the way William Sr. cultivated his lager in the cool darkness of the caves. These are the ones who might someday provide the deep nourishment it craves, who might discover too late that they have become part of the pattern, part of the cycle, part of the story that the mansion tells about itself. The Lemp dynasty ended with Charles's death in 1949, ended with his desperate attempt to seal the entity away and protect any remaining bloodline from its hunger. But the story of the Lemp mansion continues in every person who walks through its doors, continues in every night spent in its rooms, continues in the accumulated weight of attention and fear and fascination that has replaced the Lemp blood as sustenance for something that should never have been disturbed. There are houses in America where silence carries weight, where every room holds a memory too heavy to escape, where even the walls seem to grieve. The Lemp mansion is one of these houses, perhaps the most powerful of them, a place where American ambition and immigrant dreams collided with something ancient and hungry and patient. It stands today on Demonil Place in South St. Louis, its 33 rooms still magnificent, still impressive, still capable of taking your breath away with their beauty. But if you visit, if you walk those corridors and stand in those rooms, remember that beauty can be a trap, that magnificence can be a lure, and that some appetites are never satisfied no matter how much they consume. Remember that the Lemps built an empire, and the empire consumed them, that they dug their tunnels, and the tunnels reached back, that they thought they were conquering the earth, and instead the earth was claiming them, slowly, methodically, generation by generation, until nothing remained but ghosts and limestone and a hunger that will outlast us all. This has been Liturgy of Whispers. Until next time, remember that some foundations run deeper than we know, and that what we build upon matters more than what we build.